break the cue in terms of context. So context turns out to be puzzling, and those thoughts about context led me then to a re-engagement with a fairly strong and important and familiar line of discussion having to do with the effects of linguistic actions in the world, and that's the Austinian tradition, still the strongest tradition in regard to words that make for change, and his discussion of performatives, which is those statements which do something while saying something. Classically, I pronounce you man and wife, and then he, of course, has a very elaborate discussion of different kinds of performatives, etc. So it's very clear that when people take part in deliberative discussions, they seek to float performatives, to make particularly requests, which are a very classic Austinian example of the performative. And secondly, these performatives fail, and that leads me to really the core of the paper, which is how do we think of failed performatives? And here, I must confess, for the first time, I had an occasion to look closely at the work of Judith Butler, which, as an anthropologist concerned with marginal populations, with language, etc., she's a very big presence, and also in feminist gender theory and all, but particularly as a philosopher very concerned with language. And she builds on the work of a less known but very important thinker, also coming out of literature in that case, called Shoshana Feldman, whom I refer to here, who basically takes the Austinian idea and says the really important thing is to look closely at failed performatives, the performatives that appear to have no result in the world. And it struck me that most of the requests, claims, demands, complaints made in a performative manner by the poor in deliberative contexts around the world are maybe seen as failed performatives, things that no one listened to. And what I got out of that line of thinking, at least some part of it, is that failed performatives, if you look at them closely, in some instances, not all the time, have a context-changing effect. And my interest remains when our statements, linguistic statements or other kinds of actions, are context-changing, as opposed to simply complying or being legible in the context. So I use the term here, the political economy of felicity, felicity being Austin's term for what all is required for a judge to be able to say, I pronounce you man and wife, and for that to take effect. He said, well, felicity requires the judge be properly constituted, the man not, or woman not have married 4 other times, and they be adults, you know, whatever, that the right people be present, for example, forever, hold your peace, etc. That if all those conditions are met, which he called felicity conditions, because he was trying to talk about performatives, not referential statements, the sky is blue, etc., but things were supposed to have effect, then I said, well, what might we think of as the political economy of felicity? And then looking at the Feldman, Shoshana Feldman, Judith Butler line of thought, which goes back to Austin. I keep reminding us that that's really the fount of that discussion. John Searle, other people go off in other directions. And the Austinian tradition, I also note here in passing, is hard to think about without the late Wittgenstein. That language is about use, language is about the things we do with it. It's not about the dictionary, basically. It's not about reference alone, or even mainly. So where all this took me is to consider that failed performatives under certain conditions might change the context in which they occur. And that so the descriptive task becomes examining what exactly happens when performatives fail, and the move I make in the paper analytically, which I'm assured by my colleague Ben Lee, who's my main sort of guide in this very dense technical space, is not quite already simply in Feldman and Butler, but is a slightly different take, is that it's in retrospect at a certain moment in time that a precursory string of failures might turn into a success. And the simple way to put that is that when a poor woman, let's say, speaks in a gram panchayat in India, or her equivalent speaks somewhere else, indeed nothing may happen, or something even bad may happen in respect to a request. We need a well near our house, for example, or near our part of the village, and no well happens. Indeed, a well is built 20 kilometers away. That in retrospect, at a certain point, this sequence of failures can be mobilized to produce something which actually does have an effect. And that's what turned me to my own ethnographic examples from my fieldwork with a global network, but particularly its Indian node in the housing movement. And that's Slum and Shack Dwellers International, with whom I've had the privilege of working for almost a decade now. And I take some early examples of this work in the section, the ethnographic section of the paper, with some nice photos of Kofi Annan surrounded by these slum dwellers in his own lobby at the UN and so on, to say that when you put those events into the context, not only of the ones I mentioned, but a very large set of others, you have something like what I call a chain, a performative chain, to use a phrase I take from someone else, but producing what we may call a deliberative chain. That is, a set of actions, each of which may appear to fail in its moment, but at a certain moment can retrospectively harness the energies of a lot of prior failures. Because the important thing about failures, and this goes back to something of the spirit of my argument in the paper on the capacity to aspire, they build the sinews of speaking up, of making the case, of binding people in public, even if they then fail to keep the promise. But you begin to develop a kind, let's call it a kind of contractual atmosphere, a set, and I use here, following Butler and others, a kind of quasi-dramatic language. You rehearse, you repeat, you reiterate, but all these repetitions, because they occur with different actors, slightly different times, people have learned more, they stop speaking one way, they try something else. That's the fine-grained descriptive part. They're not exactly the same. So repetition is not mere repetition. That is, it's not replication, precise replication. They're constant changes. And if you look, in other words, I think, I don't say this in the paper, but I perhaps could say this now, that if you look at deliberative environments over time, of course, they are learning environments for the poor and for everybody else. They don't keep failing in the same way. You might say, like with Tolstoy, success is always similar, but failure is endless in its variety, but that endless variety lays the ground for some possibilities. I certainly don't want to make a kind of tight causal case to say, that a particular sequence of failure will yield definitively some kind of success in its own kind of environment. So if you want to get a well built, it's not that the 10th time you ask for it, the well will happen, but something else may happen because you've learned other things, and the people who you are binding in these performative contexts, because they all have to participate. For a minister to say something like, well, I've given you 200 houses for the homeless in Mumbai, but I'll give you 10,000 by the end of the year, and then not to do it may seem just like a nothing statement, but it creates a kind of binding promissory atmosphere, which can then be later used. So I think that I should stop by simply saying that all this leads me to the observation that we need not be as pessimistic, or if you wish, cynical about deliberation, that is the exercise of voice, even in, let's say, radically non-Habermasian conditions, where there's nothing resembling political parity or speech parity between the players. But even in those non-Habermasian conditions, supremely non-Habermasian conditions, we should not take deliberation lightly, because if we examine the ideas of context, of performativity, and of failed performatives as kind of grounds for some shift of context over time, then we both have a big empirical task ahead of us, which is to look at those environments, see over time whether we can discern these kinds of examples. And then, of course, we can ask more about the felicity conditions and when they actually seem to yield success over time, and when not. And then that can have very considerable, I don't say this in the paper, but I look forward to a discussion that we might then actually have something to say in regard to policy, because we might encourage people in those who are making interventions to encourage those types of contexts which might yield success out of prior failures.
Thanks, Arjun. Thanks very much.